So I got everything cut up or taken apart, and I'm pretty much ready to do some finishing stuff. Alright, so to join the leg to the top, I'm using a through mortise and tenon joint here, and the bottom here has a about a 1/4 inch Dado housing trench. So let me show you what that joint looks like by taking this apart. These tenons are about 1 3/4 inches, and the shoulder here is about 1/4 inch, and that sits on the dado in here, and the tenons poke all the way through, and they're pokes out about 1/16 of an inch. So let me show you how to cut that on this side with just some hand tools.
I've placed the chisel I'm going to use to make the mortise in between the 2 pins of the mortising gauge. I'm just dragging it along the reference face, and then cutting out the vertical rip cuts first, and then clearing a channel or a dip in the wood. This will help me guide the saw when I make the cross cut. Paul Seller calls this dip a knife wall, and it is a good idea to use it whenever there's a cross cut involved. It ensures accuracy. I'm using the same chisel I used to mark the tenons to mark the mortises here. There are several ways to chop a mortise with a chisel, but the general rule is to go slow.
Alright, so I try to take a little bit too big a chunk out at once, and I pop this side out. So it's not a big deal. I'm just going to go ahead and glue this up, and so here's a glued up repair, and it looks pretty good. There's another gluing job to be done on this side. Okay, so this is pretty well matched from both sides. Means that the markings were good, the lines were pretty square, and so I'm going to use this square shape thingy to mark the position of where the mortise is aligned with the tenon.
I scribed the lines of where the dado should be once I had the double tenon fitted. So once I checked that the vise face is going to fit pretty well, I went ahead and notched the areas of where I need to cut out so that the vise face can rest on top of the legs. Although the oak shelves were S2, I still had to do a little bit of work to get it to the right thickness and to get it nice and flat. To ensure the shelvings would be perpendicular to both legs, I did the marking on both legs at the same time. One way to think about cutting the stop dado is think of it as sort of a mortise for a tenon. And I simply line up the approximate position of where the shelf should be. This way it keeps my chisel from going over too far. And I create a dip here. Once the dip is deep enough to set my entire shelf into it, I can use it to put a scribe line down, and that's an exact measurement of where the thickness of the shelf. Now I would check it often to make sure that I didn't make the dado a little too big. It's better to make it small and then increase in size than it is to make it too big. Once I knew the shelf was going to fit in the dado well, the rest is simply getting it to the right depth. using a combination of saws, chisels, and a router plane.
One down, one more to make on here, and which way's outside? This way's the outside. Two more to make on this guy, and then I'll be complete with the two shelves. I haven't decided if I want to put drawers in there yet, so I better get cracking on.
The shelf backing is a combination of a dovetail and a rebate. The dovetails, in my mind, helps keep the legs from warping outwards because the way the legs are positioned, what was outside the tree is actually facing outwards. And if the legs were to cup, they should cup towards the outward direction of the tree, and these dovetails should resist the cupping force. The major difference between this and, say, a half-blind dovetail that one might use to join drawers is that the grains of the pin and the tail are perpendicular to each other. I cut this long rebate out on the table saw and then cleaned it up with a shoulder plane.
I just cleaned out the pins for these two dovetails, and also made this little rebate here to receive the shelf here, and it pretty much snaps in like so. So there's a little bit of a gap here, about 1/2 millimeter, probably because I cut the rebate here a little bit too aggressive. So to fix that, I could either trim the tail so it's a little bit thinner, or make the pin side a little bit deeper, and that should close up that little gap there.
I cut a curve into the backing and then reduced the height of the straight part about 1 inch. I think this gives it more visual interest and a sense of openness. The through mortise here for the footing is 3 inches, so it's a little difficult to chop this out using just a chisel. So what I did was cut about a 1/2 inch down on both sides. Then I drilled this out using a drill press. A hand drill is okay, but it's going to be a little more difficult than a drill press. And the bit I'm using just a little bit smaller than the mortise itself. And then I cleaned out the inside with a chisel, working from both sides of the mortise hole. The tenons for the footing mortises were 2.5 inches long, so they were more than my regular tenon saw that I usually use can handle, so I'm using this frame saw. So once I made this 4 vertical cuts, I decided to cut out the middle part first because it's not part of the tenon, and it's going to make the next step a lot easier. The technique of cutting with a frame saw is very similar to cutting with a plate saw. This particular frame saw is a European design. Both the European and the Chinese use the frame saw for woodworking. I'm sawing from both sides so that I can use the saw curve from one side as the guide for the other side. One aspect of woodworking that I really like is that it has no borders. It has no borders in physical barrier, and it has no borders in time barrier.
I should have these tenons freed off. Time to get them to fit into the mortise.
I like to learn techniques from all over the world and then give it a try, and if I like the new technique, then that's the one I'll adopt.
I thought I heard something crack. It looks like it's has a little bit of a belly in the middle. But as I put this on and off, all the fibers are going to compress, and it's going to get easier and easier each time I try to put it on. And when the glue hits, all of that part that got compressed will expand and fill up the space and make a really tight joint. Almost there. I feel like this one is getting caught on something. Something's getting tight. Let's redo it. Still sounds pretty good. I don't sense any sort of cracking yet. So I think I'm gonna keep going here. It's very close. There we go. That's pretty much in. There's a little bit something on the shoulders of the tenons. I'm going to clean that out, and looks like this is pretty much fitted. So one of the concerns I have with these legs, the way it's designed, is that if I hit it right here, like really hard right here, just kicking it, I'm worried that it would break these two tenons. So I'm just tracing an outline here of the tenon leg. What I want to do is cut a recess into it to seat the whole leg. It's kind of like a shallow mortise hole. So over here, I'm going to cut a recess about 1/8 of an inch deep.
Believe it or not, I came up with 15, maybe 20 designs for this, the curves of the leg. I had to take 2 weeks off trying to decide how to do the curves on this leg. But I think in the end it's worth it to make sure the project turns out just right, just so. And I could have just simply said, yeah, this is good enough. But I think good enough is a compromise, and once you start compromising on your artistic integrity and aesthetic values, then it never really ends. To protect the feet from wear and to function as little shock absorbers, I glued on these 2 layers of rubber. So this glue is really kind of dangerous, so gotta really make sure that it dries completely. And once it was dry, I can go ahead and trim it off so that it's a nice and neat edge. And I also plane the edge and sand it down to give it a slight bevel. I started by scribing 2 lines on both sides of the piece of front, and the distance between these 2 lines is just a little bit wider than the curve of the saw I'm going to use. I then masked off the 2 lines so I can see it better, because when the jigsaw is flying up and down, I don't think I'd be able to see those lines at all. I then drilled a couple of holes so that the jigsaw will have a place to turn around. I then used chisels to square off the hole, following the lines, the outer lines that I had previously scribed. A combination of rasps and files, and even power tools, were used to fit the vise to the front.
So as I'm fitting the vise front here, I ran into a bit of a problem that I didn't really think about when I was cutting and designing this. The distance between the top of the bench and this hole is about 1 3/4 of an inch. And the thickness of the top is about 1 7/8 of an inch. So when this screw goes in, there's barely any bite into the bench top here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and recess this in about 1/8 of an inch.
The recess is going to make future alignment a lot easier.
And also add a piece of reinforcement down here so that it reinforces the joint between the bench top and the bench front, as well as give the bench top some additional thickness. When I cut the front here for the drawer, I created a problem. Not a big one, but when I clamp this thing with a big enough clamp, I can actually get this bottom part here to flex. So, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn this single drawer into a double drawer with a piece of reinforcement here.
I actually decided to add this oak bar instead of having two tiny drawers.